Okay, the first thing I'm going to show you is the power of procedural terrains. And we sort of covered them a little bit in the getting started video, but we really want to go in depth and show you exactly what you can do with the procedural terrain. So we're going to go over to the left over here and load in our procedural terrain. I already have it as our default right here. If we click on it and go to the middle button and let go, we'll load in our procedural terrain. Okay, now we want to take a look at our terrain editor options for our procedural terrain. And if you're not familiar with procedural terrains, what they really are is an infinite amount of detail on a terrain object, as opposed to standard terrains, which are fixed detail. So no matter how far you zoom in to a procedural terrain, it will keep reevaluating, and you will get an update of geometry. And even as we zoom in here, you can see our polygon level is going up, and we're getting a little bit of clipping in here because the camera is so close to the terrain. But the more and more you move in on it, the more and more polygons will be created, and the more detail you get. So no matter how far you go in, you still get a nice bumpy terrain texture on that, if that's what you're going for. But that is basically the default. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this terrain now, and it's going to bring up our terrain editor. And now we can take a look at our terrain, and if you don't have this view, you can go up here to this button, the upper left, and that's our top view, and then we can go to perspective. And I like using perspective mostly because it gives us a little bit better look at what's going on. And go ahead and zoom in a little too. Now we can take a look. We actually, by default, normally have the Paint tab open. If we go to the last tab here, which is actually our Procedural tab, and this has to do with the actual texture that's creating our terrain. I'm going to actually zoom out a little. And if we can go ahead and actually scale down the size of our terrain, or that procedural texture, down to 0.5, and you can see now it reevaluated. And now we have more bumpiness in there overall, and we get an entirely different type of terrain. But of course, it's still kind of a mountain overall. So what we can do is turn off zero edges, and now we have this nice terrain. Oop, got a little bit of spin on there. If you use the right mouse button to move this around and let go at a certain time, it will spin automatically. But it can be a little touchy, so you gotta watch out for it. You can take a look here, and as you can see, the more we zoom in, it looks really pixelated, and you can actually increase the amount of your terrain. Take a look. It says 256 by 256. If we do times 2, it'll bring us up to 512 by 512, and now it's reevaluating right now, and it looks a little bit better. But that really doesn't matter because it is a procedural terrain, and this number will only really help you within this preview in this view. So I'm going to turn it back down to 256 by 256, because once again, like I said, it is in pretty much an infinite geometry terrain, and so the more you go in, the more I'll keep reevaluating, and I'll keep just looking incredible. Okay, so we're going to look at the size again. Zoom back out. If we change our scale back up to 1, we can take a look at that zero-edged terrain before we scale it down, and you can see now that we have just this large area and just an overall large terrain. But that doesn't work a lot for some of your larger scenes, so you are going to have to sort of scale that down, and it's much better to do it this way than it is to actually go in and edit this, because what you can do, if we go to our paint mode, even though it is a procedural terrain and is based on procedurals, we can still change our elevation in our terrain editor by painting on it, just as we would with a standard terrain. And there's another thing too that's kind of nice, is if I'm going to increase our flow and size of this terrain and just bring it up so we get a white point up here, and we have a flat area where we've gone completely to the highest point, and we're not going to be able to get a terrain any higher than that. Now normally if we were to use dig and then lower that down after doing this, that area would stay completely flat, and we would lose all definition in there. But since this is still based on the procedural, if we bring it back down, you can see we still have our definition and our bumps in here and around in this area, and everything looks really good. So you don't really have to worry about canceling anything out if you raise it up too high. which is a problem with standard terrains. Of course, if we do dig it down to the point where we reach a black area and then go ahead and tries to raise that back up, you will notice that we will lose a lot of the definition. So if we zoom in there, we have lost a lot of the definition, and it is pretty much a smoothed area. So that can be a problem. I'm going to hit the X on this really quick, just not so we don't save those changes I just made. And we're going to take a look at some of the mapping features as well. Another way you can change the size of your terrain, just as we did back in this procedural button. First I'm going to go back to that. I'm actually going to turn that 0 edges back on, or off rather, just so we have it all the way up to the edges. And click OK. And now if we go to this first tab up here and double click on our material to bring up our material editor, you're going to notice our mapping is object. So we have object mapping on, parametric, and I'm going to click OK. And what that is allowing us to do is to size this terrain whatever size we want, and it will remain the same shape because it is object mapping. Now if I scale this back down to where we were, and we change this, go back to our material editor and change this to world standard, it's going to ask us if we want to change our mapping node of the procedural terrain, and I'm going to say no. We don't want to pretty much preserve it because we are going to be making changes in the function editor, which I'll show you in just a bit, which is driving this whole terrain. And click OK. And you can see we still pretty much have the same terrain. There really weren't any major changes done by that. But now if we zoom out a little and go ahead and scale this, and watch it reevaluate, now we have an entirely different type of terrain where we have our texture staying the same size, but we've scaled the object, and our texture is still within this area. So we pretty much still have the same mountain that we had before in here, even though we raised it up on the Z-axis. But if we go ahead and constrain on the Z, and just move that down, and flatten it out so we don't have such high peaks, we can get a lot more variation in here, and more of a large-scale terrain, something you could really fly over and have a lot of interesting stuff going on. And you can do that just by changing your mapping mode. So you want to kind of keep that in mind depending on the scale of your shots. Sometimes this is a better method than actually going in to our terrain editor and changing that procedural tab, which we have right here for the scale, because this allows us to actually increase the size of the terrain to more of a real-life size model. So we're not dealing with a 1 meter by 1 meter model that we have this very intense terrain on. We can have a very large terrain, and as you can see, we even have haze being created on the end over here throughout the scene, which is giving it more of a life-size scale, and it looks a little more realistic that way. If you also notice too, if we go back into that terrain editor, by changing that scale, it also edited it in the terrain editor. So we're not seeing that small portion that we had before, which was basically just this center part right here. We actually went ahead and rescaled it, which resized the whole object. So we have a lot more definition, and you're pretty much just stretching out the edges, because that center portion we had before, that terrain is still right here. The only problem is our elevation is up a little bit higher. And now before, we actually went on the Z-axis in here and constrained it and scaled it down. But if you don't want to have to do that, I'm going to close this out, and we want to bring that back up to where we were, where we have it very high peak. We could change this within the terrain editor by going to and using a filter. So I'm going to double click back on this terrain, and now we see we have these high peaks like we did before, because this is going to stay the same no matter what changes we make for that constraints in outside of the terrain editor. And we're going to take a look at our filter right here under our Procedural tab. Right mouse click and go to Edit Filter. And this is our terrain altitude filter. And what we can actually do is go up here, and when we get these little arrows, because there's a point right here, and we can actually drag that down. And this is changing the overall elevation of the highest point of our terrain. So I'm going to click OK, and now as you can see, we lowered the entire terrain. And if I click OK, you'll notice that our terrain is much smaller, and that we pretty much get the same effect that we had when we constrained it on the Z. So there's different ways of doing that. You could also go ahead and do that with numeric values by going up to the third tab, or the middle tab up here, and the middle button, which is our size, and then we could change the Z and scale that down or up, or however we wanted, or to stretch out the X and the Y if you want to stretch the terrain out, but you don't want to raise up the highest point of the peaks. So if you just wanted to extend this terrain a little further, we could go in and type in 2000 and 2000 on the X and the Y. And now it's stretched out our terrain, so we still have the same amount. If you're watching the preview, you can see it pretty much just adds more ends to it. And that's because we have the world mapping on. If we had object mapping on, it would just size the entire terrain and keep those same shapes that we had. But this way we can pretty much just expand our world. So let's say we have an animation maybe going up to about this point where we have the camera, and we notice that we need a little bit more terrain, but we don't want to mess up everything we already have. All we got to do is just go into our X and our Y and change it. So if we want to bring this up to 3,000, or sorry, that's 30,000, a little big. Change that to 3,000. And if you watch the preview here, you can just see that our terrain is being extended on the edges, and we really didn't lose any definition at all, or any of the mountains that we had in the actual terrain, or what was visible. So go ahead and double click back on that. And you can see too that updated in here as well. And now we have a 3,000 by 3,000 terrain. So it's quite large, and we have lots of little pits and things like that, little mounds. But that gives you more of a world type environment where you can go through and fly through all this and not really have to worry about going in and painting anything with it. So procedural terrains are more powerful than just having the ability to zoom in infinitely on them. You can also really get some good modeling techniques out of them, so you don't actually have to go in and paint these objects. If you take a look at it, there's also a little bit more we can do with this filter, but I'm going to close this out right now, and I want to scale this down just a little bit more so we can kind of see what we're working with a little bit better. So we'll just bring it down to 1000 by 1000 on the X and the Y, and double click and go back, and now we can see we have a smaller portion of it, but it's still pretty much the same thing we had before. You notice that the peaks may be a little bit shorter, but that's the overall texture, and we could lower that with the function editor once we make it better, or sorry, the filter, once we make it a little bigger. We're going to take a look at this filter now, and we can make more additional changes if we need to. I'm going to turn on the grid, which is this third button up here, and if we go ahead and click anywhere you want a new point, I'm going to click one right there, and click New Key Point. Now we've created another point where we can adjust elevation within the elevation. So we have a lot more flexibility with editing it. And I also want to turn on curves, so I'm going to click this first button, and now we have a nice curve, and we can go ahead and rotate that, so we get a nice little hump in there. And we could raise that up, lower that down, and click OK, and you're going to notice a dramatic change. And as you can see, that's more like canyons now. And we could raise that up even higher. Just go to Edit Filter. And we could raise it up even higher. And this will give us more of a plateauing effect. And that might be a little high right there. So you want to kind of play around with it and see what you need. But there's a lot what you can do with these filters. And you could also add, like I said, more points. So just click anywhere you want a new point with the left mouse button. And then click New Key Point. And then you can create another one. And if you want to turn curves on or off, you can do that too, just by hitting this button. And that just allows a lot more variations in there, because now you can see we have this real neat looking terrain, which might not be what you're looking for, but it gives you a lot more flexibility over the control of your terrains. So now I want to reset this back to the way we had it, so we can just click on a key point and click Delete Key Point. And we're going to change this all the way back up to the top, turn off the curve so we get that nice linear effect, click OK, and we're back where we started. And now we're going to take a look at the actual function editor and take a look at the actual procedural texture that's creating this terrain. If we right mouse click on this little preview up here and go to Edit Function, it's going to bring up our function editor. And if you haven't seen this before, it can be a little difficult to find in other aspects of Vue, but it is available for many different editing options. Actually, if I go ahead and close this out right now and close out our terrain editor and just go to our surface, anywhere in any of these settings, if you notice this kind of little lightning bolt, that means we can drive it with a function or edit it with a function and use the function editor. So if I go ahead and click that highlight color, it's going to pull up our function editor for the highlight color. And as you can see, we have highlight color, color, bump, highlight, transparency, reflection, and then up on top, whether we want it based on movement, the normal altitude, slope, orientation, or time. And it's a little bit different for each one, the settings, but the overall modifiers are the same. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out because the function editor itself is an entire tutorial, and hopefully we'll be able to cover that on another tutorial. But I'm going to close this out right now, and we're going to double click on the procedural terrain and go back into the function editor for the altitude production of this terrain. Okay, now this is based entirely on altitude. As you saw before, we had for the material all different options for that specific piece of the material that we could add different functions to, but this one is based entirely on altitude. Now if we click on our little preview right here, our little node, we have a fractal node. And now this node is a simple fractal, and if we click right here, we also have other different options. We have a basic repeater, variable roughness, and all the way down to open ocean, which is actually a really neat node, which I'm going to show you in just a little bit once we're done with this. But we can keep this simple fractal checked right now, which is pretty much our default. And we can go ahead and look at our noise settings. We actually have all different types of noise settings for these specific procedurals. And keep in mind, a lot of these are meant for other options other than just terrains. Most of these are made for material editing. So we have Leopard. If we take a look at Leopard and click OK, it's going to totally reevaluate our terrain. And as you can see, we just have what would be that leopard texture. So it's a very symmetrical texture. It's repeating itself. But it wouldn't work really well for a terrain unless you were going for that specific look. Of course, that's the beauty of 3D. You can do whatever you want. But if you're going for a realism, you typically wouldn't see something like this. So you'd have to go ahead and change that. So I'm going to go back to our function editor. And actually, we should be able to just keep this open and kind of pull this off to the side to look at what's being changed. Now we have other settings in here, some that work and some that don't. Some you'll see drastic effects with. If we go to math patterns and maybe onion and now click on our terrain, you'll see we have sort of an onion effect on here. But of course there's a lot of little spikes sticking out, and it really wouldn't work well for a terrain. So a lot of these don't work well for terrains. But if we go to the Purlin Noise, these are probably the best ones for terrains. We have value, like I said, which is our default, and we get that basic terrain back. And what we actually have the ability to do is change all of the features within that actual fractal. So if we bring up our largest feature and bring that up a little higher, it's going to raise the overall area of our terrain. And actually, we raised it up so high that it bumped it up to the highest level and reevaluated itself so it wouldn't block out. So if we go maybe a little bit higher. Okay, and what it's actually doing is taking the largest feature, which is like the largest bump, I guess we could say, or the largest hill, and making it bigger and around this way, and not so much up and down. So we could bring that back down. If we bring our largest feature down to 0.26 and take a look and see what happens, you see that now we have our largest feature is very small. So all the features are extremely small, and we just have little tiny spikes everywhere. So we want to change that if we're going for realism, and take a look at that. and that looks pretty good. Around 10 is the default. And we can also change the smallest feature. So we can make that larger, which will actually go ahead and smooth out the roughness on our terrain. So now, as you can see, we have it all smoothed out. And that's pretty much the grit that you get in there. And that goes up to 10, but of course you can make it higher if you manually typed it in. But if you're going for a smooth terrain, 10 will do it. You really don't need to go any higher. 0, of course, is the smallest amount of grit, which will give you the most realism when you're going for sort of a rocky terrain. We also have our roughness. So I'm going to zoom in here and increase to 512 by 512 so we can see a better preview of it within our editor as we're changing these functions. And I'm going to bring up our roughness. And we're going to notice that we have a very spiked area now. And that's just because it's extremely rough. So these are very touchy settings. As you can see, roughness goes from 0 to 1. So it's all those little points in between that can make a very drastic increase in the overall appearance of your object. If we decrease the roughness, we also get more smoothing. I mean, it is a little bit rough in there, but not as much as it was when we had all the little spikes sticking out. We can go back to 0.5. And so a lot of the default settings for these are actually really good, but we do have the, like I said, the ability to go ahead and change any of these options. We could also adjust our wavelengths. If we bring the X up to, let's do something drastic here on the 10, and reevaluate that. You can see it's stretching it out on that X-axis. And now we have a kind of a weird shaped terrain there. But there's just really a lot you can do with it, and pretty much all of these different nodes have the same settings, or the ability to change the settings is the same. We can go back and change that, and now we're going to take a look at what the gain does. If we bring our gain up to 10 and see what happens, it's going to raise everything up extremely high. And once again, that kind of canceled it out. And we'll bring that down to the lowest point. And it doesn't seem to be doing much right now. Mostly because this is a procedural terrain, and it will make overall changes after you make your settings. Because as you can see, as that bar is kind of going across, it shows your terrain, but once it's done, it will reevaluate and show you something a little bit different. So sometimes these options do not apply to the terrain settings, and you won't get as good of an effect. So we can change that back to 1 where we're at. And as you can see now, it's lifting up very high, but once it reaches the end, it's going to reevaluate, and as you can see, we're back down to where we were. Like I said, though, there's a lot of different, we can select chipped, there's just a bunch of different options you have in here, and you really just want to go through and see what each one does, and how it affects your terrain and different looks. But a lot of the default settings are actually very good for this, but if you're going for that specific amount, or that specific look, this is definitely the way to do it, is through the function editor. And there's a lot to the function editor, not just editing these specific nodes. We could also go ahead and add multipliers and things like that. And I'll be showing that in a sec, but first there's one other thing I want to show you, and that is our open ocean. I'm going to go ahead and actually close this out right now, because we're going to need a new scene for this. I'm going to go File, New, and just select the clear spring, click OK. We're not going to save. Alright, and now we're going to add a procedural terrain again. And kind of zoom out. And we want to change our mapping mode to World Standard. And I'm going to select No, because we're actually going to be going in and changing that node. And click OK. And now we want to make this a rather large terrain, but we don't want to edit our Z too much, so we're going to go into our numeric settings, which is up on top up here. And I'm going to change this to 5,000 by 5,000. And this will make a large terrain. And we can kind of just zoom in here and move our camera around, deselect that object so we can really rotate it down. so that all we can really see is just the terrain and nothing else. If we take a look at our preview, all we see is the terrain. There is no ground plane. And actually, we can go ahead and move our ground plane down a little, because we're actually going to be using this procedural terrain as water. So if we double click on our terrain, and we're going to go to Terrain Editor, I'm going to turn off zero edges, and that way we have an equal amount all the way across. And we're going to right mouse click in our Procedural tab on this preview, go to Edit Function, and wait for our function editor to come up. Okay, we're going to select that Fractal Node and change it from a simple fractal all the way down to open ocean. And now you notice that a lot of these features have changed. We still have largest feature, smallest feature, but we lost the gain and a few other things. But instead we have wind, intensity, direction for the wind, and different waves. I'm going to go ahead and click OK right now. And as you can see, it looks a lot different than it did before. And from above, it does kind of look like water. We do have a few altitude problems there, but since we have our z-axis very small, as far as in the actual layout, we should be able to see a nice water-looking effect. Take a look at our preview here. We can actually see what actually appears to be waves, and actually that is animated. If you noticed in the function editor, this node was linked to time, and this is specifically for creating ocean and water with rolling waves, and really neat effect. If you go to Animation Display Timeline, as we scroll through our animation, you won't be able to see too much because it's going to have to reevaluate the terrain. But it's actually changing our waves, because you notice this wave was down here before, and now it's moved up. So as you move through the animation, the waves will change. And if we just take a look at our preview, you can see our waves are moving as we're moving through the timeline. Go ahead and double click on that, and we're going to go back into our function editor for this terrain and take a look and see that it is linked to time. So therefore, as we move throughout the scene, it is affecting certain variables within this node. We also have the ability, under wind, we can change the direction. So therefore, we can change the direction of the waves. Intensity, how quickly our waves are moving. And then within the waves, the choppiness, the gain of the waves, just all different types of settings we have here. We can also change the wavelengths, so we could stretch them out if we wanted and actually edit the water when we still have largest feature and smallest feature. And the only thing we really need to do, and pretty much these default settings are great unless you want to actually edit the size of that texture, which you could do. Let's say these waves are too large and we want smaller waves. Well, we could go into that editor again and scale it down. And this will scale down the overall texture, and we'll end up getting some smaller waves. And I only brought it down 0.2, so that's not going to make a huge difference, but you can see we do have some smaller waves in here. But now all we have to do to really make this water is add the water material to it. So we go ahead and click this arrow right here. We can just use the default water under liquids and click OK. And if we take a look at our preview render, we'll be able to see that change from a terrain appearance, where that default sort of brownish color, to water. If we get our preview to start going here. And it's going to take a little while to render even the preview, since we are using a Procedural Terrains, which does take a lot longer to render. But you will be able to get astonishing ocean effects from this. And you really just want to make sure that the terrain is covering the whole area of the scene, so you're not seeing the ground plane or anything beyond that terrain in the background. So if the camera is kind of tilted down, it's probably the best way to do it, because that way you can extend it to full view. But if it's tilted up, you really will have to make this terrain quite large, probably 10,000 by 10,000 or 20,000 by 20,000, which can take a lot of time to calculate within Vue. But this is one of the main reasons why we have it set to our mapping of world standard, because if we need to make this larger, the ocean larger, all we have to do is go into our size properties and up it, because right now we have 5,000. Well, if this wasn't stretching far enough, like let's say we had our camera, I'm going to back move frame 0, if we had our camera out right here, moved up, you can see we have this line where the terrain is not covering. let's say we wanted to go as far to the horizon as we could, but we don't want to lose the size of our waves. And normally if you scale something up bigger, you'll lose that size. Well, all you really have to do, since we have that world mapping mode on, we could just change our size to 10,000 and let that calculate in there by 10,000. And now we have it going pretty close to the horizon. You of course won't be able to get it directly to the horizon just because it would have to be such a large object, but the size of our waves has stayed exactly the same because of that mapping mode. And if it was on object mode for the mapping within that material editor, you would notice the waves are getting larger and the whole terrain is getting larger. So that's a way to really change that. And like I said, the preview in here too doesn't really matter too much unless you want to actually go ahead and you could edit the filter. And if we bring that down and click OK, you notice we have more of a water effect in here, and even with the function or that filter going down that low, we still have really high peaks. So we can edit that down even lower, and that's if you want to do it within your terrain editor and not have to rely on the actual z-axis. Of course, our preview is going to look very pixelated because we're only set to 256 by 256, but it pretty much gives you an idea. The best thing to do is really change it on the z-axis, and it really gives you more control. And that way you really don't have to reevaluate the terrains as often. Go ahead and click OK. So that's a really neat way to create ocean effects. And like I said, as you move along the timeline, you'll be able to actually see these waves rolling. And all you really have to do is apply a water preset material to it, and you can use any of the water presets will work, and any of the materials in general will work. If you wanted mercury looking waves or ocean type waves, you can add a material like that onto it. So there's really a lot you can do with it. It's a really neat node function we have there. Okay, I want to show you a little more couple more things you can do in that function editor. And I'm gonna file new and just open a new scene. I'm not going to save this because we're going to work on a terrain again, and then it's easier to do that than resize that water back down. So I'm going to add another procedural terrain and move this down just so we can see it, and double click on the terrain, turn off zero edges because you get a much better looking terrain that way, so not everything is a mountain. And we're going to edit function and pull up our function editor. Now let's say we have one really nice terrain that we have, really nice settings for it, but we want to add something to it. But we don't want to have to destroy what we've already created. So if we have this amount right here, and let's say we wanted to add something else onto it, where we could kind of blend them together, well, we actually have the ability to do that, and I'm going to show you how to do it. First thing we want to do is click off and deselect this area, which is going to give us sort of these invisible boxes we can click on. And we want to add a fractal node. So we're going to go to this button right here and click Add Fractal Node. And that's the exact same fractal that we have right here, because they're both default. But let's say we wanted to change this in here to cellular padding crystals. And now we wanted to blend these two textures together, because let's say maybe we'll just bring our largest feature down on this other one. It's a little bit tighter, but we want to blend these two together so we have little bumps with some larger surface area in there, creating higher peaks and things like that. What we can actually do is go ahead and click on this texture, and we can click this sort of Y looking thing, and that's going to give us our combiner. And this combiner node lets us link different nodes together. And actually, if we click on it, we have it set to blender right now. And if we go up to this, we kind of have this little point sticking out here. That's because it's not assigned to this fractal node yet. So if we click on that Y and grab that and just pull it onto that little selection that came about, and now these two are linked together. And if we select our combiner node, we actually have these two blending together, and we can change how much the influence is between the two and how much they're affecting each other. And we can change this to add, or max, min, subtract, multiply, and if you're familiar with Photoshop or any filters like that, even in Lightwave and other software programs where they have blending modes, you can change those to those types of nodes in here. We can go to multiply as well, and we'll have to reassign that because now it's set to just multiply, and we really don't get any options. But if we send it back to Blender and we change the mode to multiply, we can adjust the ratio then, and we have to reassign that because it keeps deselecting itself. But we can also adjust this ratio based on another little editor here. So if we click on this, and now as you can see we have this K, which is a constant node, and this constant node is directly linked to that ratio. So if we don't want to have to keep clicking on this Y and then going to that, if we have a bunch of different things selected, we can just have these constant nodes come out. I'm going to go ahead and change the value that way, which will combine the two together. So I want it more towards this other texture, and I'm going to click OK. And it'll reevaluate that. So now we have all those tight bumps from that second texture, but we still have our overall terrain, our overall large areas from that original node. So we can go in and you can do multiple combiners on certain things and really put them all together. So there's a lot of power to the function editor. And go ahead and click OK, and we see how that looks. And we end up with a pretty neat looking terrain. A lot more variation to it. Of course, our altitude isn't exactly very high, so what we can do is hit the Z and go ahead and pull that up if we wanted to. And that'll give us a lot more definition in there. And there's just so much you can do with the function editor that just play around, take a look at some of the different nodes, because if we were to go through all of them right now and show what they did, it would take the next couple of hours. So really want to play around with it and take a look and see which ones are even usable, because some of them aren't usable, like I was showing you before, where they're really based on materials, and you want to use them for texturing and not for creating terrains. So you have to really go through and see which ones are available and not creating the kind of effects that you don't want. Because of course, even with this crystal effect, you can see we have all these little spikes in here, which might even be a little bit too much. So we can go ahead and change that if we needed to a more compatible node. So there's a lot you can do with that function editor, and you still also have the ability to change your filter even after editing anything in the function editor. You can still go through and add a filter if we wanted to, and kind of change that up. So there's a lot of power to your procedural terrains, and I'd prefer them more than anything to standard terrain, because then you don't have to go through and paint everything in, unless you're going for a specific terrain. And of course, even then with your procedurals, you can still go in and raise up these areas and edit them as you need to and adjust their overall size. So there's a lot of power to it.